The flight attendant stopped mid-aisle, pointed at the black woman in first class and said, "You don't belong in that seat." What she didn't know was she had just made a mistake that would shake the entire airline industry. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today, and if you like stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. The gate buzzed with the usual airport noise, boarding calls, rolling suitcases, and quiet chatter. In the middle of the crowd walked Anaya, a black woman in her early 50s. Her posture was upright, her steps calm. She wore a simple navy blue pantsuit and carried a leather handbag in one hand and a hardcover book in the other. Her silver-streaked hair was tied into a neat bun. There was nothing flashy about her, yet she carried herself with a presence that turned a few heads without even trying. She didn't look around for help or hesitate. She walked straight into the first-class cabin and located her seat with quiet ease. As she placed her bag in the overhead bin and sat down, a flight attendant named Karen approached. Karen's walk was stiff, her face already tense as if she had been holding back irritation all day. Her uniform was sharp, but her smile was missing. She stopped in front of Anaya's row and stared for a moment before speaking. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said loudly. "I believe you're in the wrong seat." Her voice wasn't kind. It was sharp, enough for other passengers to pause what they were doing and listen. Anaya looked up without surprise, her face calm. She reached into her inner jacket pocket and pulled out her boarding pass, handing it over. "This is my seat," she said politely. Karen glanced at the ticket but didn't really look. Her jaw tightened. "This is first class," she said, as if that explained everything. "You must have a basic economy ticket, probably row 25 or 26. Anaya kept her voice steady. "No, it's correct. Seat 2A, first class. That's what's on the boarding pass." She offered the ticket again, patiently. Karen didn't take it. She had already turned halfway toward the front of the plane, waving her hand to another crew member. "Can someone double-check this passenger seat? I think we've got someone sitting where they shouldn't." A few passengers nearby shifted uncomfortably. One of them, a man in his 60s named Roger, peeked over his glasses from across the aisle. Another woman, Sophia, who had been sipping her water, slowly set down her cup, her eyes fixed on the scene unfolding. Still seated, Anaya waited. Her expression hadn't changed, but her eyes were sharp, watching everything, remembering everything. Karen turned back to her, now more forceful. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside while we sort this out. We have other passengers trying to board." Her voice was louder this time. 2 rows back, a young woman named Tara had paused her music and was already watching with her phone in her hand, camera tilted slightly upward. Anaya didn't argue. She placed her book on the seat and stood. Her movements were smooth, quiet, controlled. Not once did she raise her voice or show anger. She just stood there, letting Karen lead her away from the seat she had paid for, away from the space she rightfully belonged in. The cabin grew quieter, not because people weren't talking, but because no one quite knew what to say. They had all seen what happened. They just weren't sure yet what it meant. Karen led Anaya toward the front galley with quick steps, glancing over her shoulder as if trying to avoid eye contact with the watching passengers. Anaya followed without a word, her face calm, her hands steady by her side. Behind them, whispers began to stir among the first-class passengers. Roger leaned toward Sophia and said quietly, "She had the boarding pass." "I saw it." Sophia nodded, her eyebrows drawn together. "And the attendant didn't even check it properly." In the galley, Karen pulled out a small tablet and tapped the screen with sharp fingers. Her frustration was obvious, but Anaya still didn't say anything. She stood tall, silent, eyes calmly watching Karen struggle to control the situation. Karen finally spoke into her headset. "Yes, I have a woman here claiming she's in seat 2A, but I don't think she's supposed to be there. Can you confirm her name on the manifest?" There was a pause as she listened, biting her lip. On the other end, the gate agent responded, "Passenger name is Anaya Wells. First class. Confirmed. Paid. Checked in over an hour ago. Is there an issue?" Karen blinked. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. "No issue," she mumbled and ended the call quickly. She didn't turn to Anaya immediately. Instead, she stared at the wall, then took a deep breath, as if trying to decide what to do next. Before she could say anything, the curtain behind them parted and the captain stepped into the galley. His name tag read, Captain Reynolds. His voice was calm but firm. "Everything okay here?" he asked, looking between the two women. Karen straightened her back quickly. There was just some confusion about a seat assignment, but it's all sorted now. Anaya didn't move. She didn't smile. "It wasn't confusion," she said softly, her voice clear. "It was assumption." The captain looked at Karen, then at Anaya. His eyes flicked to the ticket still in her hand. "Are you all set in 2A, ma'am?" he asked. "Yes," Anaya answered, "but I'll wait here until she says it." Karen's face flushed. Her eyes darted to the captain, then to the curtain, then finally back to Anaya. She swallowed hard. "Your seat is confirmed, ma'am. You're welcome to return." Anaya gave a single nod. "Thank you. That's all I needed." With that, she turned and walked back toward the cabin, slow and steady, while passengers watched in silence. Karen stayed behind, frozen, the weight of what had just happened finally settling on her shoulders. And somewhere near the back of the plane, Tara hit the record button. As Anaya stepped back into the first-class cabin, the silence was thick. Every eye turned toward her. Some passengers looked away quickly, pretending to be focused on their phones or magazines. Others watched openly. Roger gave her a small nod as she passed. Sophia offered a faint, encouraging smile. Anaya returned to seat 2A, picked up her book from where she'd left it, and sat down without a word. The air felt different now, tight, uncertain. Even the passengers who hadn't paid much attention earlier could feel it. Something had shifted. Tara, seated several rows back, had stopped pretending to scroll through social media. Her phone rested on her knee, still recording. She whispered to the man beside her. She didn't yell, didn't argue, but you could tell she wasn't going to let it go. The man just nodded, eyes still fixed on the front of the cabin. Karen returned a few moments later, her posture stiff, her expression blank. She walked past Anaya without a word, not even a glance. Instead of checking on first class, she went straight to the galley and stayed there. A different flight attendant, Mia, stepped out moments later and quietly began checking on passengers. Her voice was soft, her smile forced. She paused by Anaya's seat and said in a low tone, "Would you like something to drink, ma'am?" Anaya glanced at her, then shook her head. "Not at the moment." In the back of the plane, Tara finally paused her recording. "This is going to blow up," she whispered to herself. They messed with the wrong woman. She didn't know who Anaya was, not yet, but something about her composure, her quiet strength, made it clear that this wasn't over. Tara uploaded the clip to her story with a short caption. She had a first-class ticket. They still tried to move her. Within minutes, comments began rolling in. Back in first class, Anaya stared out the window, her face calm, but her mind sharp. She wasn't surprised by what had happened. She had seen it before, many times in different places, under different names. But this time was different. This time, they had done it on record, in front of witnesses, and to someone they clearly hadn't taken the time to research. She reached into her bag, pulled out her phone, and typed a short message. "Situation developing. Flight 228. I'll handle it, but prepare a response." Then she tucked the phone away and opened her book again, eyes skimming the page, though her thoughts were miles away. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, the captain was speaking quietly into his headset, briefing the airline's operations team. "Passenger situation has been noted. There may be fallout. You'll want to flag this." On the other end, the response was short. "Who's the passenger?" The captain glanced down at the manifest, then paused. "Anaya Wells went in, Muzz," he said. There was silence for a moment, then a quiet reply. "Understood. We'll monitor closely." In the main cabin, Tara refreshed her phone and saw the views climbing by the second. Within 10 minutes, her short video had already been reposted by a popular activist account with millions of followers. Comments flooded in, some shocked, some furious. The words "first class," "black woman," and "discrimination" filled the screen again and again. Someone had already added subtitles to the clip and posted it with the caption, "She stayed calm." They exposed themselves. Back in first class, Mia continued moving down the aisle, offering water, collecting jackets, trying to smooth out the tension that still sat heavy in the air. Roger leaned toward Anaya again. "That was handled poorly," he said in a low voice. "You were very composed." Anaya glanced at him, offering the smallest smile. It happens more often than you think. In the galley, Karen gripped the edge of the counter, her palms sweaty. She had checked the system again. Anaya's ticket was not just valid, it was marked with a special note. VIP clearance. High-level government traveler. Karen's stomach turned. She hadn't bothered to look closely before. She had assumed. And now, with whispers growing in the cabin and the other flight attendant giving her quiet glances, she realized she had made a serious mistake. Just then, the captain's voice came through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Flight 228. We're scheduled for an on-time departure. Please settle in and ensure your devices are in airplane mode. We'll be taking off shortly." As the plane began to taxi, a notification buzzed on Anaya's phone. She turned it over briefly. It was from her assistant. "Social media picking it up. We'll prepare a statement if needed." Anaya locked the screen again and slipped the phone back into her bag. She didn't flinch. She didn't react. But the message only confirmed what she already knew. This incident was no longer just between her and a flight attendant. It had started to spread. Karen re-entered the cabin and quietly took a seat in the jump seat near the front. She avoided eye contact with everyone. Her hands were clenched in her lap, her breathing shallow. She hadn't been spoken to yet by corporate, but she knew it was coming. One wrong assumption, one raised voice, and now the airline was likely facing a storm it couldn't contain. As the plane lifted into the sky, the seatbelt signs clicked on, and the cabin grew quiet. But the silence wasn't peaceful. It was waiting, watching. Something had started the moment Karen opened her mouth, and no one, not even Anaya, knew exactly how far it was going to reach. 30 minutes into the flight, the cabin settled into a forced normal. Drinks were served, trays clicked into place, and the hum of the engines filled the air. But the unease hadn't disappeared. It only hid beneath quiet glances and unfinished thoughts. Anaya sat with her book open again, eyes scanning the words, though she wasn't reading. Her mind was somewhere else. She had spent years in courtrooms and meetings, in closed chambers where silence held meaning. This moment felt no different. Something was unfolding, and she was letting it breathe. In the galley, Karen stood facing the wall, her headset hanging around her neck. Her mind raced through excuses, through explanations. She hadn't recognized Anaya. She hadn't known. But even as she told herself that, another thought crept in. Would it have mattered? She had seen a quiet black woman in a first-class seat and assumed the worst. And now it was out of her control. Mia stepped in quietly. "You should sit down," she said softly. "Take a moment." Karen didn't reply. Instead, she glanced at the curtain that separated them from first class and whispered, "Did you know who she was?" Mia hesitated. "Not at first, but I recognized the name when I checked the manifest again." Karen's face fell. "So it's true?" Mia nodded once. "She's a Supreme Court judge." Karen turned pale. She sank onto the jump seat, her hands shaking slightly. She hadn't just made a scene, she had publicly humiliated someone who had spent her life fighting injustice. Someone whose name carried weight in every legal and political circle in the country. And she had done it with cameras rolling, with witnesses, and without a second glance at the truth. Meanwhile, in row 7, Tara refreshed her feed again and nearly dropped her phone. Her post had exploded. Tens of thousands of views had turned into hundreds of thousands. Dozens of big accounts had shared it. One tweet read, "They tried to kick a Supreme Court judge out of first class. Imagine how they treat people with no power." She turned to her seatmate, a quiet man in his 20s named Omar, and whispered, "It's going viral." "Everyone's talking about it." Omar leaned over to look. "Is that her real title?" Tara nodded. "She's been on the bench for almost a decade. I just looked it up. She's written opinions that changed federal law." Omar stared at the screen. "And they tried to move her like she didn't belong." Tara sat back, shaking her head. They had no idea who they were messing with. At the front of the plane, Anaya finally closed her book and looked out the window. The clouds stretched endlessly in every direction, white and soft, untouched by the world below. She didn't need to speak. She had already spoken loud enough, without saying anything at all. The flight continued smoothly through the sky, but the tension on board only grew heavier. It was no longer just about one uncomfortable moment between a passenger and a flight attendant. The truth had begun to move beyond the walls of the aircraft. Every minute that passed, more eyes outside the plane were turning toward what had happened in Seat 2A. The video now had over 500,000 views, and comments were flooding in from every direction. Law students quoting Anaya's landmark cases, activists calling out airline discrimination, everyday people sharing their own stories of humiliation while traveling. It had become a symbol, a spark. In the galley, Karen remained seated, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had tried calling her supervisor, but the call didn't go through. She tried to look busy, but her thoughts wouldn't stop racing. She imagined the moment when someone from corporate would call her name. The email, the meeting, the consequences, the shame. Mia watched her from the other side of the galley and sighed. "You need to be ready," she said gently. "They're going to reach out. If not during the flight, right after we land." Karen didn't answer right away. Then with a shaky breath, she whispered, "I've been flying for 12 years. I've handled drunk passengers, medical emergencies, angry customers. But I never thought something like this." Her voice caught. "I didn't think she was anyone important." Mia gave her a sharp look. "That's the problem. You didn't think she deserved to be important. You looked at her and made a decision based on nothing but how she looked." Karen's mouth tightened. She couldn't argue. She knew Mia was right. Meanwhile, up in Seat 2A, Anaya checked her phone again. Another message had come in, this one from her chief clerk. "Media requests are coming in. Do you want to respond before landing?" She didn't reply. Not yet. She needed time to think, to measure every step before taking it. She had learned long ago that when people expected emotion, silence could be more powerful. She wasn't going to turn this into a loud, angry battle. It wasn't her style. Her strength was in strategy, in making sure that every move hit where it mattered most. In the row behind her, Roger leaned over to Sophia. "Do you think she'll sue?" he asked quietly. Sophia shook her head. "She doesn't have to. The internet is already doing the job." Across the aisle, a young couple had started reading articles about her on their phones. One of them whispered, "She once ruled on a case that changed how schools discipline students. She's not just another judge. She's one of the few who's actually made things better." Tara noticed all of it. The whispers, the research, the way people were slowly shifting from confusion to admiration. She opened her notes app and started typing. She didn't know why yet, but she felt like this story wasn't just something to post about. It was something she needed to write down fully. Then mid-flight, the seatbelt signs chimed off, and the captain's voice came on again. His tone was slightly different this time, measured, more serious. "Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your patience and cooperation. We want to remind everyone that respectful conduct is expected on board at all times. If any passenger has concerns or questions, our crew will address them appropriately." It wasn't just a general reminder. Everyone knew that. It was a quiet signal, a sign that the airline was now aware and watching. Anaya remained still, hands resting lightly on her lap. She didn't smile, didn't smirk, but her eyes, calm and steady, told a different story. She knew exactly what that announcement meant. She had played this kind of game before, where institutions tried to fix their image faster than they fixed their behavior. She reached for her water and took a slow sip. Outside the window, the clouds rolled by, soft and white, unaware of the storm brewing on the ground. The quiet in first class stretched longer than usual, almost heavy. It wasn't the calm kind that passengers appreciated on long flights. It was the kind that made people think before speaking. It was the kind that made small actions seem louder. Every sip of water, every turn of a page, every whisper carried more weight now. No one wanted to be caught saying the wrong thing. No one wanted to be the next one recorded. Anaya remained steady in her seat. Her posture hadn't changed, and her face showed no trace of emotion, but everyone around her sensed that she was no ordinary passenger. It wasn't just the rumors anymore. One of the flight attendants, a younger man named Felix, had confirmed it in a quiet moment. "Yes," he told a curious passenger. "That's Justice Wells. She's on the Supreme Court." The news spread quickly through the rows, not with excitement, but with quiet awe. Most people had never met a judge before, let alone someone that high up, And now they all realized that the woman they had watched being pushed aside was one of the most powerful legal minds in the country. In the galley, Karen's hands trembled as she held her phone, scrolling through social media, her face drained of color. The video was everywhere, multiple angles, comments flooding in, people tagging the airline, legal experts weighing in, journalists trying to identify which airline and which flight. She knew it was only a matter of time before the company released a statement, and she already suspected what would come next. Suspension, review, and maybe more. She looked up suddenly when the cockpit phone rang. Mia answered it, listening closely. After a few seconds, she looked over at Karen. "That was the captain," she said quietly. "Corporate just confirmed who she is. You need to prepare an official apology before we land." Karen's mouth went dry. "They want me to apologize to her?" "They're not asking," Mia said. "They're giving you one chance to show that you understand what you did. One chance." Karen nodded slowly, her chest tightening. "I didn't mean to. I didn't know." Her voice trailed off. The words felt weak, and even she could hear it. Mia looked at her carefully. "It's not about what you meant. It's about what you did, and how many people saw it." Back in the cabin, Anaya leaned her head slightly against the headrest and closed her eyes, but she wasn't resting. Her mind was at work, going over every detail. Karen's tone, the reaction from passengers, the lack of response from crew members who stood by, unsure what to do. She had seen systems fail before, and she knew the signs. But what struck her most was the silence. The kind that came not from respect, but from discomfort. The kind that showed how quickly people backed away when things got uncomfortable. She didn't blame them, but she remembered every face that turned away. Tara, still watching from a few rows back, opened her laptop. She had written half a blog post already. Not for clicks, not even for followers. She just felt like this story mattered. Not because a judge had been disrespected, but because the only thing that had stopped it from going further was who the woman turned out to be. "If she hadn't been important," she typed, "if she had just been any other black woman in that seat, what would have happened?" The truth was hard to ignore now. People were only shocked because of who had been mistreated, not because someone had been mistreated at all. And Anaya knew that too. At the same time, in the operations room of the airline's headquarters, a team of executives sat gathered around a conference call, reviewing the footage, the media response, and a growing storm of public backlash. "We need to act before this gets worse," someone said. "She's not just a judge, she's a shareholder too. She's been on our legal advisory board." The room went quiet. That detail hadn't reached everyone yet. "She has the power to take this much further," another voice said. "We need damage control now." Back in seat 2A, Anaya opened her eyes again as Mia approached slowly, holding a piece of paper. "Justice Wells," she said quietly, her voice calm. "I've been asked to deliver an apology on behalf of our crew. We understand that what happened earlier was unacceptable." She handed over the paper with both hands. "Karen will speak with you before we land." Anaya accepted the note, her fingers folding it neatly before placing it into her bag without a glance. "Very well," she said. Her tone was quiet, cold. Mia stood still for a moment, unsure what to say next. Then she gave a small nod and stepped back. Anaya turned her head slightly and looked out the window again, her face unreadable. But beneath that silence was something sharp. The kind of quiet that didn't forgive. The kind of quiet that planned. The sky outside had begun to shift from bright blue to a muted gray as the plane moved closer to its destination. Soft clouds rolled across the windows like a calm blanket. But the mood inside the cabin was anything but calm. First class sat in a strange stillness, where passengers whispered behind open magazines or stared ahead without really looking. No one had gone back to normal. Not after what they had seen, not after what they now knew. Anaya sat perfectly upright, her hands resting on her lap. She hadn't touched her book since returning to her seat. Her mind was too full, not with emotion, but with calculation. She had learned a long time ago not to react in the moment. Reactions could be twisted, but control, calm, clear control, left no space for excuses. Behind the curtain, Karen was pacing in the galley. Her name had just been mentioned in a private message from airline operations. They weren't waiting for landing anymore. They were moving fast. An internal report was already being prepared. Her name was at the center of it, and she knew that the apology they had told her to give wasn't just for show. It was her last chance to protect what was left of her career. Mia stood at the galley entrance, watching her. "Are you going to do it?" she asked, her voice flat. Karen rubbed her forehead and looked away. "I've never apologized to a passenger like this before." "Then it's about time," Mia replied, not with anger, but with something close to disappointment. Karen walked to the curtain and paused. She smoothed her uniform. She took a breath, and then she stepped out into the cabin. As she approached seat 2A, the entire section seemed to hold its breath. Passengers who had stayed silent earlier were now alert, phones still in hand, eyes wide open. Karen reached Anaya's seat and spoke, her voice low but clear. "Justice Wells, I want to apologize for my earlier actions. I made a mistake, and I take full responsibility. I shouldn't have questioned your seat, and I certainly shouldn't have raised my voice the way I did. It was wrong." Anaya looked at her, her face unreadable. She let a few seconds pass, long enough to make the silence sharp. Then she spoke. "What exactly are you apologizing for?" she asked calmly. Karen blinked. "For assuming you didn't belong in first class." "No," Anaya said. "That's not the full truth." Karen stood frozen. The eyes of the entire cabin now burned into her back. "You didn't just assume I didn't belong," Anaya continued. "You treated me as if I had done something wrong. You didn't ask to see my ticket. You told me to move. You raised your voice. You embarrassed me in front of a cabin full of strangers, all before confirming a single fact. And you did it because of how I look." Karen's mouth opened, but no words came. Anaya's voice remained calm. "So before I accept your apology, I want to know, do you understand the difference between a mistake and a choice?" The silence that followed was heavier than any turbulence. Karen's eyes dropped. "Yes," she said quietly. Anaya didn't smile. She didn't nod. She simply replied, "Then I suggest you remember that the next time you decide who belongs where." Karen whispered something like, "I will," and slowly stepped back. Her face was pale. Her legs felt unsteady. She returned to the galley like a shadow, and when she reached the jump seat, she sat down and stared at the floor. There was nothing left for her to say. In the cabin, several passengers looked toward Anaya with quiet admiration. Roger tapped the armrest lightly and whispered, "Well said." Sophia simply exhaled, a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Tara, now in full focus, opened a fresh document on her laptop and began typing fast. The conversation she had just witnessed wasn't just a powerful moment, it was a perfect closing to the story she was already planning to share. Not because Anaya had shouted, she hadn't. Not because there was drama, there hadn't been any, but because the truth had been spoken clearly, in front of everyone, and not one person could deny it. And still, Anaya didn't relax. She didn't fold her arms or lean back. She stayed as she had all flight, collected, patient, steady, because she knew this moment wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The world outside hadn't heard from her yet, but they would, and when she decided to speak, they'd listen. Not because of her name, not because of her title, but because truth, when delivered with calm precision, carried more power than outrage ever could. The cabin slowly returned to quiet conversation and soft clinks of glassware, but something had permanently shifted. The kind of shift that couldn't be undone by snacks and polite service. The flight crew did their best to keep the routine flowing, refilling drinks, offering hot towels, asking passengers if they needed anything. But it all felt like a distraction now. No one had forgotten what happened. Most weren't even trying to. Everyone knew they had just witnessed something rare and powerful. Anaya remained composed, not showing the slightest trace of victory or satisfaction. For her, this wasn't a moment of pride, it was a reminder. Even at the highest levels, with decades of achievement, with a name known in the most powerful circles, she could still be treated like a criminal for taking her rightful seat. That truth wasn't new to her, but now others had seen it with their own eyes, and this time, it had been caught on record. Tara typed nonstop. Her fingers moved fast, but her thoughts were even faster. She wasn't writing an article anymore. She was writing something bigger, a personal piece, something that showed how these moments weren't just about single people or isolated incidents. They were about a pattern, a quiet, everyday pattern that too many ignored. She had flown dozens of times and seen things like this happen again and again. This time it had gone public only because the person on the receiving end had the power to push back. But what about the others who didn't? She looked over at the couple across the aisle, both still scrolling through news on their phones. "It's everywhere now," the woman whispered. "Look, someone just tweeted the airline stock is dropping." Her partner leaned in. "She hasn't even said anything publicly yet. Can you imagine what'll happen when she does?" Farther back, in the premium economy section, Omar refreshed his phone and stared at the new headlines. News outlets had caught up. "Supreme Court Justice mistaken for seat intruder on first-class flight," one read. Another headline was harsher. "Airline scrambles after judge's public humiliation goes viral." He turned to Tara. "Are they going to wait until landing to issue a real statement?" She shook her head. "They're probably writing 5 drafts right now. None of them will be enough." In the cockpit, Captain Reynolds had just received another call from operations. He listened carefully, nodded once, and hung up. Then he made another short announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for flying with us. We'll begin our descent shortly. Please make sure your seat belts are fastened and all carry-on items are stowed." His voice was even, but there was a slight tension behind it, the kind that came from knowing he was flying straight into a media firestorm. In the galley, Karen sat hunched over, still in uniform, but her usual poise was gone. She had been told to stay seated after the apology, not to engage further, and to wait for instructions upon landing. "They'll talk to you once we reach the gate," Mia had said. Karen nodded without looking up. She had already checked her employee portal. A meeting was scheduled on her profile within the hour. That meant someone had already begun writing a formal report. Her future with the airline now rested in the hands of a board she would never meet, and in the memory of a woman she had tried to dismiss. Back in the seat 2A, Anaya closed her eyes again. Not to rest, but to think. She had already received updates from her assistant. The footage had reached lawmakers, legal circles, even other judges. Her inbox was filling. Some offered support. Others offered silence disguised as professionalism. But what mattered most was what came next. She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. She opened a blank email, addressed it to her communications team, and typed, "Prepare controlled statement. No names, no anger, just truth. Focus on dignity, systemic patterns, and accountability. Final draft by morning." She hit send and slipped the phone away. Her focus wasn't on revenge. It was never about that. She wasn't interested in one person losing a job. She wanted the system to be forced to face itself. The quiet racism hidden behind smiles. The assumptions packed into customer service scripts. The policies that gave power without consequences. She glanced around the cabin one last time. Some passengers looked away. Others met her eyes. Most held that same awkward expression, respect mixed with shame. She understood it. She had seen it in courtrooms, in conference rooms, in board meetings. The moment when people realized what they had allowed, simply by staying silent. The plane began its slow descent, and as the city below came into view through the windows, so did something else, a reckoning. One that had started quietly, with a voice that never needed to be raised, and it hadn't ended yet, not even close. As the wheels touched down on the runway, the cabin jolted slightly, and a few passengers clapped out of habit. But this time, there was no cheerful relief in the air, no excited chatter about reaching home or connecting flights. Instead, the entire aircraft felt wrapped in tension, like everyone knew they had just lived through something far bigger than a flight. Something that wasn't finished just because the plane had landed. Anaya remained seated, hands resting gently on her lap. She didn't rush to gather her things. She didn't stand. She waited, as always, calm, composed, controlled. Around her, people shifted awkwardly in their seats. Some passengers kept glancing at her and then quickly looking away. Others stared openly, as if still trying to figure out how such a powerful presence had been so easily dismissed hours ago. The seatbelt sign chimed off, and the usual scramble began. Overhead bins opening, bags being pulled down, people pushing into the aisle. But Anaya remained still. She had no interest in being among the first to exit. This wasn't about leaving quickly. It was about what waited on the other side of that door. Tara stood in her row, laptop now packed, phone in hand, and turned briefly to look toward Anaya's seat. She didn't speak, didn't want to intrude, but the look in her eyes carried meaning. I saw it, I recorded it, I shared it, and now the world knows. Anaya met her gaze with a soft, almost imperceptible nod. At the front of the plane, the door hadn't opened yet. Instead, two airport security officers waited just beyond the jet bridge, speaking with a tall woman in a dark suit, an airline official from corporate. Her name badge read, Operations Executive, Dana Brewer. Her face was tense, eyes focused on the plane door as if it might explode the moment it opened. Inside the aircraft, Captain Reynolds stepped out of the cockpit and walked to the front of the cabin. He didn't say anything at first, just stood quietly, glancing across the rows of first-class passengers. When his eyes met Anaya's, he gave a slight nod. Not performative, not forced, just acknowledgement. Then he spoke softly to the lead attendant and stepped back. Mia, still shaken from earlier events, moved carefully toward Anaya. Justice Wells, she said gently, we've been asked to request that you wait on board for a moment. There are representatives from our corporate office who would like to speak with you, if you're willing. Anaya looked up, her face neutral. I'm not here to offer forgiveness, she replied. If they're here to listen, I'll speak, but only once. Mia nodded and stepped back, giving space. Karen remained in her jump seat, clutching her folded hands so tightly her knuckles had turned white. She had been told not to move, not to speak, and to remain on board for questioning after all passengers had disembarked. Her thoughts were scattered and wild. Part of her still wanted to explain, to defend herself. Another part already knew nothing she said could change what had been captured on camera, repeated in posts, dissected in articles, and burned into memory. As passengers began filing out, several paused by Anaya's seat. Roger stopped, holding his briefcase in one hand. Thank you, he said simply. Anaya nodded. No need for more. Sophia followed, her voice low. I didn't speak up. I should have. You still can, Anaya replied, her voice firm but kind. Don't wait for the next one. Tara passed by last. She didn't speak at all. She only held her phone against her chest for a second, almost like a quiet salute. Then she moved toward the exit, her eyes burning with determination. When the last passenger stepped off, the cabin door finally opened, and the airline executive entered, followed by the two security officers. Dana looked around, spotting Anaya immediately. She approached with careful steps and stopped in front of her. Justice Wells, she said, her voice rehearsed but respectful. On behalf of our airline, I want to personally apologize for the treatment you received today. We take this matter extremely seriously, and we will be conducting a full internal investigation. The flight attendant involved has already been placed under review. Anaya didn't move. I'm not here for your company's protection, she said flatly, and I'm not interested in performative apologies. What I want to know is this. How do you plan to change a culture that allowed this to happen in the first place? Dana's face tensed. She had expected anger. She had prepared for outrage. But this calm demand for real accountability was much harder to answer. We've already begun preparing new training programs. We're reviewing hiring and conduct policies. We'll be issuing a formal statement within the hour. Anaya looked at her. That's a start, but let me be clear. I will not be silent. I will speak publicly. And when I do, I will be asking your company the same questions I'm asking you now. Dana nodded slowly. Understood. Anya stood, gathering her bag, and paused before stepping into the aisle. She turned toward Karen, who hadn't dared look up. What happened today wasn't just about you, she said. It was about what you represent. That should worry you more than losing your job. With that, Anaya walked past the executive, past the officers, and stepped into the jet bridge. Dignified, steady, and silent. Behind her, the cabin was still. The story wasn't over. It was only waiting for its next chapter. The airport terminal buzzed with its usual rhythm, passengers rushing to connections, families reuniting, announcements echoing from overhead. But something was different at Gate 47. A quiet stir had gathered near the arrival area, where several journalists, camera crews, and legal observers stood with eyes fixed on the glass doors leading from the jet bridge. Phones were out. Cameras were rolling. They weren't there for a celebrity or a sports figure. They were waiting for the woman who had shaken an entire airline without raising her voice. When Anaya emerged, her steps were measured. She walked with the same grace she had carried throughout the flight, composed, not hurried. She didn't pause for questions, didn't smile for the cameras. Her phone buzzed in her coat pocket, and she ignored it. There would be time to speak, but it would be on her terms and in her own way. A few steps behind her, Dana Brewer followed, clearly unsure whether to stay close or back off. The executive presence was expected, maybe even necessary, but Anaya didn't slow down for her. She didn't acknowledge her. This moment didn't belong to the airline. It belonged to the truth. Tara stood near the back of the crowd, trying not to draw attention. Her video had now passed 2 million views. Dozens of outlets had reposted it, and journalists were using screenshots to headline articles. Her blog post was scheduled to go live in 20 minutes, and her inbox was already filled with interview requests. But she didn't feel proud, not yet. What she felt was responsibility. She had recorded a truth that could no longer be denied, and now the world was watching to see what would come from it. A few rows away, a law professor from the university in the city stood waiting as well. She knew Anaya from conferences, from panels, from landmark court decisions. She hadn't expected to see her under these circumstances, but she wasn't surprised that even now, Anaya held herself with more power and silence than most did with microphones. Security staff flanked the path quietly, not for protection, but to keep the chaos under control. Anaya walked straight through, never breaking pace, never acknowledging the growing crowd. She exited through a private doorway and was met by her assistant, Elias, who stood holding a tablet and looking as calm as ever. "Media is already preparing segments for the evening news," Elias said, walking beside her as they made their way to the car. "You're trending on every platform. The airline just released a basic apology. It's being called weak." Anaya gave a small nod. "Expected. They're planning a press conference this evening," he added. "They'll likely offer compensation, training plans, and public statements." "That's not enough," she said. "They want this to pass with minimal fallout. I want structural change." Elias didn't reply. He simply opened the car door for her. As she slid into the back seat, he handed her the tablet. On it was a draft of the public statement her team had prepared based on her earlier message. She scanned the screen in silence, then spoke clearly. "Cut the opening. Don't make it about me. Make it about the pattern. Add 3 cases of similar treatment, real ones, verified. And end it with a demand for federal policy reform and customer bias training across all major travel industries." Elias nodded. "I'll have the final version ready within the hour." As the car pulled away from the terminal, Anaya finally let herself exhale. Not from exhaustion, but from the weight of strategy. She knew what had happened today wasn't unique. She had spent a career writing decisions about discrimination, bias, and institutional failure. But this time, it hadn't come from a courtroom. It had come from a cabin at 30,000 feet in front of everyday people who now couldn't claim ignorance. Back on the tarmac, Karen was led through a side exit by an internal affairs representative. Her uniform was wrinkled now, her expression empty. No media had gathered for her. No one rushed to record her story. She was told she would be contacted by HR within 24 hours and placed on immediate leave pending investigation. She had no words for the officers who walked her through the hallway. No thoughts left to explain herself. Only a sinking realization that one moment of unchecked judgment had become something irreversible, something permanent. As the news spread beyond the airport, stories began surfacing from other passengers. Tweets, posts, and video clips piled up. Black doctors denied access to lounges. Latina women questioned for premium tickets. Families asked to switch seats by mistake. It was as if the flight had ripped the lid off something long hidden. Now people weren't just sympathizing, they were remembering. By the time Anaya reached her home, her statement had been released. It was short, focused, powerful. It didn't name Karen. It didn't mention the airline by name. But it said everything that needed to be said. This was never about a seat. This was about assumption, about how easily judgment is passed when the person sitting in a place of comfort doesn't match what some expect to see. I do not want apologies. I want systems to change. And if they do not change willingly, they will change by pressure, because silence is no longer acceptable. Not in courtrooms, not in airplanes, not anywhere. The response was immediate. Messages poured in, articles were rewritten, advocacy groups issued public letters in support. Airline competitors released their own statements, promising to review internal protocols. The Federal Transportation Committee released a memo stating it would consider holding hearings. And through it all, Anaya remained calm. She didn't chase interviews. She didn't demand a spotlight. She simply sat at her desk, reviewing documents, sipping tea, and answering only when it mattered. Because this wasn't about headlines. It was about what came after them. Night fell over the city, but the storm hadn't slowed. If anything, it was only gaining strength. News networks cut into their regular programming with panel discussions and breaking news alerts. Talk show hosts opened their monologues with the incident. Editorial headlines asked hard questions. How many times has this happened off camera? Do first-class rules apply equally to all? What does dignity look like when no one is watching? In every story, one name stood at the center, Anaya Wells. But the focus had shifted. It wasn't about her seat anymore. It wasn't even about her title. The country was beginning to talk about the patterns she had pointed out, the silent, constant erosion of dignity that happened to people of color in places of comfort. The way suspicion followed them into boardrooms, restaurants, hotel lobbies, and airplane cabins. At the airline's headquarters, tension had reached its peak. The board of directors had called an emergency meeting. Their public relations team was overwhelmed. Their customer service lines flooded. Shareholders were demanding answers, and their legal department was now aware that the woman at the center of the story wasn't just a high-profile passenger. She was also someone with deep connections in federal regulatory circles. Someone whose words could shape policy, not just headlines. Inside a glass-walled conference room, CEO Marshall Dray sat stiffly at the head of the table. Screens showed live social media analytics. A red line showed the brand's reputation falling in real time. One of the executives spoke carefully. She hasn't filed a legal complaint. Not yet. She doesn't need to, someone else replied. Her statement alone is doing more damage than a lawsuit ever could. Dre rubbed his temples. Where are we on a response plan? We've suspended the flight attendant. We've issued a public apology, but it's being seen as too little, too late. The public wants action, not words. And what about Wells? She's made it clear she's not interested in compensation or private meetings. She wants systemic change. She's positioning this as a policy issue. Dre sat back slowly. Then give her one. The room went quiet. Draft a national policy recommendation on airline anti-bias protocols. Include training, oversight, passenger protection language, everything. Send it to her legal team for review. And put her name on the advisory panel if she'll accept. But, a director started. No more buts, Dry snapped. She holds all the cards now. Meanwhile, in a quiet office on the other side of the city, Anaya sat with Elias, reviewing the proposals already flooding in. Advocacy organizations wanted her to lead joint statements. A national civil rights group asked her to headline a campaign. A university requested her to speak at a legal conference on systemic bias. Every request came with urgency, but she chose carefully. She wasn't interested in noise. She wanted precision. This one, she said, pointing to a coalition proposal for federal guidelines on traveler equity. Have them expand the language to include intersectional data tracking and a whistleblower policy for employees. And tell them I'll support it. But I want the first draft published within a week, not a month. A week, Elias nodded, typing quickly. She leaned back, eyes sharp. People have short attention spans. If we let the story slow down, they'll move on. The pressure has to stay high until change is locked in. Across the city, Karen sat alone in her apartment, the lights off, her phone face down. Her suspension notice had arrived by email. Her social media profiles had been closed, and she hadn't left the house since the plane landed. No calls from her supervisor, no statement from the union, just silence. The kind that left space for reflection or collapse. She stared at the wall, haunted not just by what she had done, but by how easily she had done it, by how normal it had felt in the moment. She kept thinking back to the sound of her own voice, raised in front of dozens of strangers, treating a woman with quiet dignity as if she were a problem to be removed. The shame wasn't public yet, but it was sharp and private and unrelenting. And somewhere deep down, Karen knew the worst part of all. If there hadn't been a video, if Anaya hadn't been someone powerful, she might have done it again, and no one would have stopped her. Back at Anaya's home, the living room lights were dim, the city glowing through the windows. She sat at her desk, flipping through notes, ignoring the buzz of notifications. She had just received a message from a senator, someone she had worked with on past judicial nominations. The message read, "If you're ready to go further, we'll back you." People are listening. Anaya stared at the screen for a long moment, then closed the message. Not out of fear, but focus. She didn't want to become a symbol. She didn't want to be anyone's hero. She just wanted to make sure that the next time a black woman sat in seat 2A, she wouldn't have to justify it. She wouldn't have to explain. She wouldn't have to prove a thing. She'd just sit, like anyone else, and be left alone. And until that was true for everyone, Anaya wouldn't stop. The next morning arrived with headlines that no longer needed dramatic phrasing to grab attention. The facts alone were enough. Justice Anaya Wells rejects private settlement, demands national standards. Federal committee schedules hearing on racial bias in air travel. Airlines brace for industry-wide oversight. The narrative had shifted from outrage to reform. What started as a viral clip had matured overnight into a national conversation, one that wasn't just reacting, but beginning to organize. At her home office, Anaya moved with quiet focus. Her desk was now covered with papers, not legal briefs or case summaries, but outlines for proposals, drafted language for legislation, contact lists of equity advocates, educators, transit workers, and even former flight attendants who had already reached out to support the cause. This wasn't a single-issue campaign anymore. It had become a movement, and she was the unwilling but determined face of it. Elias entered with 2 mugs of coffee and a fresh printed report. "They're calling it the Wells Standard," he said, placing the report beside her. "It's already being mentioned in early drafts of airline reform discussions." Anaya lifted an eyebrow. "That wasn't the goal," she replied quietly. "I know," Elias said, "but that's how people work. They name what they want to follow." She said nothing for a moment, sipping the coffee. Then calmly, "Then we make sure the standard is worth following." Elsewhere, inside a sleek government building in Washington, preparations had begun for an emergency hearing. A special committee on civil rights and public transit had scheduled an open session for the following week. The name Anaya Wells was already printed on a placeholder at the witness table. While no one had publicly confirmed her attendance, officials were hopeful. The chair of the committee, Representative Harris, had personally requested her presence. His letter read, "We need your voice, not as a victim, but as a builder of what must come next." Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Dana Brewer sat in a long meeting with the airline's executive team. Her hair was pinned back, her suit neat, but her tone had sharpened. She was no longer in damage control. She was in recovery mode. "Our legal department has confirmed she isn't filing a personal lawsuit. That's not her play," Dana said to the group. "She's not after money or headlines. She's after accountability. And if we don't act like we understand that, we're going to fall behind the entire industry." A senior manager frowned. "You want us to let her lead a policy rewrite?" "I want us to follow her lead before we're forced to," Dana replied flatly. "We need a full overhaul. Bias training isn't enough. We need transparency, third-party oversight, passenger protection protocols, whistleblower support, real change." There was silence for a moment, then a quiet murmur of agreement. Fear was no longer driving the conversation. The reality was, and the reality was this: they had been caught failing, publicly, repeatedly. And now someone was holding up a mirror and refusing to let them look away. Back at Anaya's office, her phone rang again. This time it was a call from a retired airline executive, a woman in her 70s who had followed Anaya's career since her early judicial appointments. Her voice was low but firm. "I've watched this industry make excuses for decades," she said. "If you push this through, it won't just protect passengers. It'll protect employees, too. There are people inside these companies, people like I once was, who want this change more than you know, but they've been too scared to start it. Anaya listened quietly, nodding. When the call ended, she leaned back in her chair, her eyes fixed on the sunlight streaking through the window. She had no illusions about how long reform would take, or how hard it would be. But now she wasn't alone. People were stepping forward, some quietly, some publicly, some with their names, others anonymously, but all of them, tired of watching and saying nothing. Later that day, a small but powerful event took place. The airlines board voted to approve the initial draft of the Wells Advisory Protocol, a new internal program that would document, report, and respond to incidents of discrimination within the company. Not with apologies, with investigations, real consequences, real change. The first clause in the protocol was simple. Every passenger deserves dignity, without assumption, interruption, or interrogation. The clause wasn't just approved, it was signed into policy before sundown. That evening, Anaya walked through her neighborhood quietly, coat buttoned, phone off, no security detail. Just another person on a city street. Some neighbors nodded in recognition. Some smiled politely, unsure whether to say anything. She didn't need praise. What mattered was something far quieter. The systems that once ignored people like her had been shaken, not by protests, not by lawsuits, but by the simple act of refusing to move. And now, with the eyes of a nation watching, those systems had a choice: change or be changed. She had made the first move. Now she was waiting to see who would follow. 2 days later, the hearing chamber at the Capitol was packed. Reporters lined the back wall, their equipment carefully positioned to avoid blocking the view. Rows of congressional aides took notes behind their laptops. Spectators sat shoulder to shoulder, whispering quietly, many of them ordinary citizens who had never attended a hearing before. The mood in the room wasn't tense, but it was focused. Everyone understood this wasn't a routine session. It had the weight of something larger than procedure. At the front sat members of the Committee on Civil Rights and Equity in Public Transit, their nameplates gleaming beneath polished microphones. They shuffled their papers and whispered to one another, occasionally glancing toward the double doors. And then they opened. Anaya Wells entered the chamber with the same poise she had shown on the plane, shoulders back, gaze steady, stride unhurried. She wore a charcoal gray suit with no visible jewelry, her silver-streaked hair pinned in place. No entourage followed her. Just Elias, who stayed a few paces behind, holding a small briefcase and a folder of prepared notes. But Anaya didn't carry anything. Not a bag, not a phone, not even a notepad. She didn't need one. As she took her seat at the witness table, the murmurs in the room died down. Committee Chair Representative Harris tapped his microphone lightly. "We welcome Justice Anaya Wells to this session. We thank you for your time and your willingness to speak with us today." He paused. "We know the public has been following the events of this week closely. This hearing is not about one flight, one airline, or one incident. This hearing is about patterns, about lived experience, and about the need for enforceable standards that protect dignity and equity in travel." Anaya gave a single nod. When the time came, she adjusted her microphone, took a breath, and began. "I am not here today because I was mistreated," she said calmly. "I am here because my experience is one that mirrors the experiences of countless others, people who lack the title, the platform, or the privilege to have it taken seriously. No theatrics, no dramatics, just words chosen with precision. I was told, without question, that I did not belong in the seat I had paid for, not because of policy, not because of protocol, but because of assumption. That assumption was built not in a day, but over decades, by an industry culture that too often allows bias to operate without challenge." She paused only for a second. "The attendant who questioned me did not do so as a rogue actor. She did so as part of a pattern that has gone unchecked because it is rarely recorded, rarely believed, and almost never punished. But it exists." Members of the committee leaned forward, their attention fixed. No one checked their phones. No one shuffled papers. "What happened on that flight was unacceptable," Anaya continued, "but it is not unique. What made it different was the camera, the witness, and the public response. But change cannot depend on those things. We cannot build justice systems that only activate when someone hits record. We need systems that function because they are designed to protect people in the first place. Her voice never rose. She never pointed fingers. Yet the silence that followed her every sentence felt thunderous. I am recommending the following: mandatory anti-bias training with real-world testing and accountability measures, federal guidelines on equitable treatment of all passengers, regardless of appearance, a national reporting database for incidents of discrimination on flights, and a third-party oversight body that includes passengers, not just executives, in reviewing complaints. Gasps didn't fill the room because her recommendations weren't shocking. They were obvious. What made them powerful was that they were being said here now by someone who could no longer be dismissed. She leaned slightly toward the mic. And finally, she added, I would recommend that every airline, every terminal, and every employee read the statement issued by the airline that removed me. Not because it was perfect, it wasn't, but because it revealed something far more important. It showed what companies only say when they fear being exposed. I want to see what they say when no cameras are rolling. That's where real culture lives, and that's where we must begin. The room remained still for a long beat. Then Chair Harris nodded. Thank you, Justice Wells. Your words are not only heard, they are now part of the record. Applause wasn't allowed in the chamber, but it wouldn't have mattered. The silence that followed was louder than any clapping could have been. It was the silence of respect, of truth, of recognition. Outside the building, dozens of protest signs waved in the air, held by people who had never even met Anaya. It's bigger than a seat. We all belong in first class. Assumption is not policy. Inside her car later that day, Elias handed her a tablet with the full transcript of her remarks already going viral, but she didn't read it. Instead, she asked, what are the airline responses? 3 major airlines released statements supporting your recommendations, he replied. 2 said they'll implement parts of your framework. 1 asked to meet with you privately. I'm not interested in private, she said. Not anymore. As the car passed the Capitol building behind them, Elias asked, what's next? Anaya looked out the window. Now we watch, she said. Not for what they say, for what they do. And in that answer, the hearing ended, but the accountability had only just begun. Weeks passed. The news cycle moved on as it always does, pulled away by elections, celebrity scandals, international crises. But something from that day on, Flight 228 lingered, not just in headlines, but in conversations, in policy rooms, and in the subtle way people began to shift how they looked at authority, power, and belonging. Justice Anaya Wells didn't return to the public spotlight after the hearing. She had no interest in television interviews, book deals, or foundation launches. She quietly declined awards, politely passed on speaking tours, and made it clear she would not become a mascot for justice. I am not the story, she had told Elias when a national news outlet offered her an exclusive primetime special. The system is. Keep the attention there. But her influence only grew. The federal committee she addressed issued a unanimous recommendation to adopt the Wells Protocol across all major airlines. Within a month, the Department of Transportation announced it would begin drafting a nationwide framework based directly on her proposals. Airlines that had remained silent early on now scrambled to align themselves with the movement, not out of guilt, but survival. Shareholders pushed for internal reforms. HR departments, once focused on damage control, began reviewing training manuals line by line. The phrase Wells Standard entered corporate language, not just in airlines, but in hotels, train stations, and boardrooms. Anywhere customers interacted with people in uniforms who could, at any moment, decide who belonged and who didn't. In universities, her testimony became required reading in law courses on civil rights. Students studied the tone, the strategy, the restraint. Professors used it to teach the difference between moral outrage and systemic change. In the streets, smaller stories began surfacing. Passengers standing up for one another, employees pushing back on bias they had once ignored. A Latino man in business class recorded a similar incident and cited Anaya's story when filing a complaint. The airline acted immediately, not because of the video, but because of the precedent. Even Karen's name, once whispered in anger, faded into anonymity. Her personnel file was quietly closed. Her employment officially terminated. There was no press release, no statement. Only a quiet email from the airline's executive board that read, "No tolerance for implicit bias at the cost of dignity." She moved out of state shortly after, reportedly working in a different field. The world had not destroyed her, but it had moved on without her. One afternoon, months after the flight, Anaya sat on a park bench beneath a sycamore tree. She wore no robe, no suit, just jeans, a sweater, and an old scarf she'd owned for years. A young woman approached hesitantly, maybe 22, maybe younger. She had a notebook in hand and a nervous smile on her face. "Excuse me," she said. "Are you—" Anaya nodded gently, saving her the awkwardness. "I just wanted to say thank you," the girl said. "I was in law school when it happened. I almost dropped out. I didn't think the system was ever going to change. But when I watched you speak at the hearing, it made me believe again. It made me stay." Anaya looked at her carefully. "Then make sure your reason for staying becomes someone else's reason for fighting." The girl nodded, eyes bright, and left without another word. She hadn't asked for a photo. She hadn't posted it online. It was the kind of encounter that didn't trend, didn't go viral, but stayed. Elias approached a few minutes later with a folder of papers. "You've been invited to sit on the advisory panel for the Department of Transportation," he said. "They want your guidance as they draft the national equity policy." Anaya took the folder, flipping it open. She read for a moment, then closed it. "Tell them yes," she said quietly, "but only if we have voting power, not ceremonial." Elias smiled. "Already added that clause." She chuckled lightly, then stood up, brushing the leaves off her coat. As they walked together toward the sidewalk, she paused for a moment, looking at the city ahead. The streets bustled like any other day, cars honking, people rushing, lives moving. But somewhere within that flow, the world had shifted, quietly, lastingly, because one woman hadn't raised her voice. She had just refused to move. And in doing so, she made an entire system take a step back and then forward, not for herself, but for everyone after her. And now that seat, 2A, meant something. Not because it was first class, but because someone once sat in it and refused to be told she didn't belong. If this story moved you, make sure to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this every week.